All right, so this is a little bonus feature that I'm doing on the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast YouTube channel. I think I'm going to call it Hessler's History Interruption, as I just kind of periodically interrupt our normal programming on the podcast. Might talk about different topics, or when I have a friend who's written a book or something like that. Just kind of a little bit of a change of pace here. I want to welcome my good friend, Allen Thompson. Allen is the author of the forthcoming book, In the Shadow of the Round Tops, Longstreet's Countermarch, Johnston's Reconnaissance, and the Enduring Battles for the Memory of July 2nd, 1863. So first of all, Allen, my friend, welcome. Thanks for agreeing to waste some time talking to me tonight, and I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So you and I know each other, but for the sake of people who might be watching this, you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and specifically how you got so interested in Gettysburg, and then we'll go into the topic of the book specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I live in New Jersey, down by the New Jersey shore. I've law practice down there, so in the spare time, always been a Gettysburg fan. Got into it, I think, like most of us, our age, anyways. The movie really kicked it off for me. Realized that that wasn't the end all; that there might be something missing. Um, and so I just started digging deeper, and I got hooked on I guess on the first person accounts probably about 10, 15 years ago. I was like, wow, there was so much more than the signs in the park, and they do a great job with everything, but there's more to it than that. And so I just came across Sam Johnston, and I said I really got into July 2nd. Said that would be a great place to start. Everything goes wrong, right? Johnston
Yeah.
messes up the recon, and uh, then Lee relies on it, and everything goes awry from there. So I started researching it, and I realized that at least to me, seemed to be a pretty wrong interpretation that Johnston messed up.
Okay.
So I got into Johnston. I did an article a few years ago for Gettysburg Magazine. Some people seem to like it, and so they would ask me follow-up questions. Hey, you do a biography on Johnston, so that's really how it started. Is I wanted to kind of do a follow-up article, maybe a biography of Johnston, and as anybody looking into it realizes real quick, there's not a whole lot out there about Sam Johnston. And so it's like, but I saw the connections between that and the Countermarch, and at least in his own mind, and I just went from there. And 4 or 5 years later, here we are.
Okay. And I've had the pleasure, as you know, because you gave me a copy. I've had a pleasure of reading an advanced copy of the book, and I certainly think it's going to give Gettysburg enthusiasts a lot to chew on. And as I've said, I think maybe challenge a lot of what people think they know about, particularly about July 2nd. For the sake of people who are listening, we've kind of jumped right into Captain Johnston's reconnaissance. So you want to talk to us maybe a little bit about who Captain Samuel Johnston was and kind of the part that he plays in your story?
Yeah, absolutely. Sam Johnston unfortunately gets a lot of slack. Let's say the traditional story, the standard story, has always been, or I'm going to backtrack on that. It hasn't always been. I'd say it's a little bit more of a modern, the last 30, 40 years. Johnston's reputation for his reconnaissance is kind of taken a nosedive. Sam Johnston was an engineer in private life. He was a young guy. I think he was 30 at the time of the battle, ballpark. And he had been the only engineer on Lee's staff, basically from, I want to say June, right when Lee takes over, until April of 1863. So he's got close to a year where he's the only representative of the engineer corps. He is pointed out and recognized by Jeb Stuart when he's doing some kind of freelance work. He joins the war as a cavalry officer. He's a lieutenant in the 6th Virginia, which is not the same company, I don't believe, but the same regiment that Armistead's son is in. They miss each other, but little pre-Gettysburg connection there. But when he's doing this freelance work as a cavalry officer for scouting for Jeb Stuart really takes notice of him. He says he's very good at what he does. That catches Lee's attention eventually. He gets promoted. He does some more freelance work while he's waiting for his commission to clear. And then he's assigned to Lee's staff. And he kind of bounces around between all of the corps commanders for a while.
Right.
At Antietam, he's with Longstreet, so Longstreet knows who he is. This is not some random guy at Gettysburg. Oh, who's this staff officer? So that's one of the reasons he kind of comes into play in this whole controversy, is everybody knows who he is. He's an easy person to remember. The 7 days he's scouting, when they find out at Malvern Hill that McClellan has infamously or famously, depending on which side of that aisle you're on, when he's retreated from Malvern Hill or changed his base, again, whatever you prefer, it's actually Sam Johnston that gets up to the Federal trenches in the pouring rain, and he reports with another engineer who unfortunately dies before Gettysburg, but Richard Meade, ironically, is the last name of the guy. But so they find out, they report to Lee and Jackson. He's at Chancellorsville. He's actually leading McLaws's men, or backtrack on that. He's not leading the men. He's scouting the routes for the attack. And he's in charge of making sure the Union Army doesn't recognize and that they haven't given away the flank attack for Jackson's famous flank attack. So he perches himself up in a tree, and he's taking notes and watching, and according to him, he almost gets shot out of the tree by a cannon at Chancellorsville. And so he's well known. He has led troops to their locations, like he's accused of doing poorly at Gettysburg. Never a corps, so no more than a brigade that we can tell. So he's got experience. Everybody knows who he is. He's not just some random captain who leads. He's in the background. Hey, you go. He's very well known.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, not only well known to Longstreet, but well known to McLaws, or at least experience with McLaws as well, which obviously are going to be two of the key players he's going to interact with on July 2nd. Okay, so then you want to take the story from there. On the morning of July 2nd, 1863, we've established Johnston's resume a little bit. You want to talk about what Lee orders him to do, and then maybe go from there in terms of how maybe some of the key findings in your work might differ from some of the standard interpretations that people have read about him.
No, absolutely. And we'll keep some things as a surprise. So you can read.
I've signed my non-disclosure agreement before we all started. So yeah.
Yeah, right. It's but no. So the gist of it is, so on the night of, in the evening of July 1st, they're creating these plans. And you've read the book. We spent a decent amount of time going over the setup on July 1st. And so the idea is this attack, a dawn attack. Who's supposed to lead it? Depending on who you ask, they're going to give you a different answer. But there's supposed to be an early morning attack. That goes awry because Allegheny Johnson doesn't get onto Culp's Hill. We all know the story about the scout that goes awry and they get shot at. They rush back the hill. There's prisoners captured and all that. Lee doesn't get that news though until about 4 o'clock in the morning on July 2nd. So then he's got to change his plan. And so he really spends most of the morning on July 2nd changing the plan and figuring that out. And a big portion of that, but as we go into more on some of the ancillary things in the book, a big portion of that is Johnston, but not all of it. Johnston's a pretty big part of it, but there's a decent amount going on outside of that. So Johnston's goal is to go find out, well, if we have to change this plan, if the initial plan is to attack Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, or from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Hill, and put a pincer movement to Cemetery Hill, now we have to change the plan. And so that involves moving around to the right, or the federal left, whichever perspective you're going to take there directionally. Johnston has to find out where is the left. Uh, Anybody paying attention, of which Lee obviously was, his skirmishers are out. People are still reporting to him. It's not just Johnston. So they know that there are troops coming up, but they don't know where they went. And so, you've been on the battlefield a few times.
Yeah,
it's
once or twice, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you know what it's you go to Seminary Ridge, there's only so much you can see. You know, we don't have a map. Batchelder doesn't have a map series. We don't have the electric map. There's no great presentation from Morgan Freeman before Lee goes out here. He can see what he can see. And you can't see what's beyond that ridge. And so one of the things Johnson has to do is find out those guys that were coming up, are they back there? And so using Little Round Top as kind of a guide, a beacon, he's going to go check it out. So that's why Little Round Top, did he get there? Did he not get there? That's one of the reasons that comes into play, because he does bring it up eventually that he got there. But it's not so much as a vantage point as it is a beacon, a waypoint is for him to keep his bearings. So Johnston comes back and he reports, what? Nobody knows. That's one of the biggest assumptions. And every time I talk to people about this, they're always surprised that there is no report that we know of from Sam Johnston. Right. Everybody assumes that he made this report and he said, I didn't see anybody. There's no Union troops anywhere. And so it's clear you can attack up that way.
Well, where's the assumption come from? Like you say, this idea that he's telling Lee, that I've made it across the Emmitsburg Road. I saw some cavalry. I got up to the Round Tops. Where does that come from?
As far as, naming names or pointing fingers, that's not something, I tried to avoid that a lot in the book. Everybody's doing the best they can with limited info, but it does seem to come from the idea that whoever started it, it comes from this idea that Lee wouldn't have done what he did if he knew the Third Corps was there, the Second Corps was there. He just wouldn't have done it. And one of the things we explore in greater depth than we can even do today is why it was still a good plan at the time he made it in the morning. Right. Obviously things changed, that's not a revelation. Things change from 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So this is it's a fluid situation, as somebody would say.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase once or twice too. I'm not sure who likes to overuse that one, but that's all right.
I like the phrase.
I like it too, right?
Descriptive. But so things are moving, they're changing. I go into detail on this in the book, the article that's already out, issue number 61, if anybody cares. It goes into detail on what could he have seen, because we don't know what he actually saw. He didn't say. He does say he got to Little Round Top, but to be perfectly even, headed on it, he says that in, I believe, 1895. Is when he actually says the words Little Round Top. It's his last letter he wrote on it. So maybe he didn't. I think he did, but it's up for debate. Reasonable people can disagree on the interpretation. But it's not about what can he see where he got. It's about, are there troops where he did get? And everybody agrees that he got to the southern part of the battlefield.
Right, somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I tend to think that he couldn't possibly have missed knowing where he was. If I can figure out where Little Round Top is, just by standing there looking at it, I assume that a trained engineer who's at a year of military engineer training knows where it is.
Yeah. And I would personally, I would agree on that. We've heard different theories over the years. He went to Bushman Hill. He went to some hill that's out near the Eisenhower Conference Center today and all of that. And that's always been honestly my standard response on it too. Well, he was a trained engineer and I don't know how he could mistake one for the other, unless memory is coming into play, which is a big focus of your book. And as you said, he apparently doesn't name the hill until years later. Or the piece that, people never like to accept is maybe he was flat out lying. And I'm not passing a judgment on that. I'm just sort of passing the ball back to you to see what you think about it, either one of those.
Yeah. I personally don't think he's lying. Not because I spent a lot of time studying him, but because it just doesn't seem, having studied him, it doesn't seem like a trait of his.
Mm-hmm.
He is very open about what he remembers and what he doesn't. He doesn't say, "Well, it was definitely this." He said, actually, most of it, and you've seen it. A lot of it is, well, if I remember right, I can't really remember. So he's really not saying I definitely did this or I definitely did that if he doesn't actually remember. And second, he doesn't really have a reason to lie about it in 1895 or 1892 or 1878, the three times he's writing.
Mm-hmm.
As you said at the beginning, his reconnaissance really isn't criticized until, I'd say, the second half of the 20th century. It's his countermarch stuff, which is how we got into the countermarch. That is where he takes the bulk, if not all, I would say, of the contemporary criticism. Yeah. So the fact that he got to Little Round Top actually plays against him, because if he got there, then he knew the roads and he saw, the signal stations. He saw all of this stuff that works to say, not to go this way. He's admitting that he knew about, and he still took him the wrong way. Mm-hmm. So it works today from our perspective that, well, of course I got to Little Round Top and I could see everything and there wasn't anybody there, but that's not what the focus was then. And to get back to the original question, I think he does see everything that you would expect him to see. But again, it's a fluid situation. Things change. Everybody's where they are on the morning of July 2nd when Sam Johnston, if he's on Little Round Top, is there, is not the same as it is when Lee orders the attack, and it's not the same when Longstreet gets there to attack.
Yeah. So then if you were to summarize, based on your research, based on all the study you've given this topic, morning of July 2nd, 1863, to summarize, what do you think Johnston tells Lee or doesn't tell him, and how do you think that ultimately informs the final plan of attack?
So I think he essentially tells him, here's where the position of the Union Army is, mm-hmm. and it's not, it's no further south than the Trossel Form. And so if you look at the original design of the plan, that's essentially where you expect a little bit of resistance in the peach orchard, but Kershaw's supposed to be wheeling as he's pushing the troops out of the peach orchard, or right after, depending on how you interpret it. You don't do that if there's an entire corps there, or you think there's a corps there. You do that if there's minimal resistance in the peach orchard and everybody's back further. So I think he tells him that here's where the Union Army is, which again is much farther north than it becomes eventually. And I think he tells him, maybe this isn't the best ground in the world, because then what does Lee do? He goes back to Cemetery Hill to check it out again. I mean, everybody agrees about that. Pendleton, Johnston, or Pendleton, Ewell, rather, Marshall, Armistead, Long, they all agree, even though they hate Longstreet, 20 years after the war, they all agree that Lee goes to see Ewell at around 9 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. And I think that is to decide which side is better here. They both have their ups and they both have their downs. What's ultimately the right decision here?
As far as his role as a reconnaissance officer, how much do you think at this stage he is informing Lee and Longstreet in terms of not only where did I get, not only what did I see, but how much is he informing these guys in terms of, and I know how to get there?
That's a good question. My own opinion is that there's not a lot of that going on. One of the things I think I'll deliberately say for the book is who is in charge of that and what the intel is there. I do not think it's Johnston. He mentions it every time to a degree that, well, I kind of took note of some of the roads. But one of the things that I think, if there's any emphasis of the book, you mentioned memory, we can get to that at some point. But one of the other emphasis of the book is that we have to look at it from their perspective, not our perspective. And I really, really try to hammer that home with all the different accounts. Is Johnston is saying he looked at some roads, and we look at that knowing what we know today. It's Black Horse Tavern Road, Fairfield Road, maybe Hares Ridge Road. That's not necessarily what Johnston's talking about, you know. So he may have scouted roads. Roads could be farm paths. Roads could be other roads that are not those three roads. And he doesn't know at the time exactly where Lee wants to attack. He just knows, okay, this is the general direction we're looking at. If we're going to attack here, what are some options? So he's not looking to make a route for Longstreet.
Yeah. Okay. There's a there's this often quoted exchange. Lee and Longstreet and others, they're sitting on a log, they have a map out. McLaws, who plays a part in your book, obviously. McLaws comes up and they talk about, and again, this is all accounts afterwards, force fitting into the morning of July 2nd. But they talk about this exchange between Lee and Longstreet. General Longstreet, I want your troops placed so, and Longstreet says, okay, General McLaws, go this way, and Lee rebuts him and says, no, General Longstreet, that's not what I want. McLaws allegedly offers to go scout out a route, and Longstreet says, no, I don't want you to leave your division, and things of that nature. My recollection when I read the manuscript, that's kind of a traditional interpretation of Confederate planning, morning of July 2nd. My recollection when I read the manuscript is, again, maybe you were a little critical of that traditional interpretation. Maybe, again, you thought some things coming in afterwards or memory playing a part. You just want to talk about what you think of all that?
Yeah, so that is a big portion of the book. McLaws is one of the main, people that we follow. But I guess the easiest way, I mean, if we don't have hours and hours to spend here.
Well, we could if you wanted to, Allen, but no.
I got all night. But I definitely think it's a one-sided interpretation. McLaws is the one writing it. He's writing it for a reason. He's not writing it as a story for his grandkids. He's got a history with Longstreet. Longstreet's, got who's going to tell this story, I guess is the better way to say it. They're coming under a lot of criticism for the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. Longstreet's the leader of the First Corps. McLaws is in the First Corps. He's leading the column that day. He doesn't have a good history with Longstreet. I think McLaws is trying to get out in front of this, and that becomes his account. Is it entirely made up? No, I don't think it is. One thing I try to be very clear about is I don't call anybody a liar. Mm-hmm. I think memories get clouded. The reasons people think things and remember things are often caused by the circumstances they're in. And so he's trying to defend himself. And go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say and I didn't mean to interrupt, even though the point of the show is my interruption. No, but one of the things I wanted to point out while I'm thinking of that I liked about your book is I think, very often when attorneys write history, they often start with a verdict. I don't want to say often, but we've seen it happen. They'll start with a verdict and then kind of work their way backwards to fit the verdict, basically like they were building a prosecution or a defense of their client, whichever the case might be. And you don't do that in this book. You're not definitive. You don't accuse people, but you just kind of say, look, this is this is where my research, I think, has taken me, in that sort of thing. So, I just kind of wanted to call that out, that I like that you took that approach with the accounts.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, the more I read about memory in general, and like you said, the science of memory is kind of a background to everything. One of the things I point out real early in the book, I think the intro even, is that we don't have videotape, we don't have audio recording, we have some great still photographs of what it looked like after, but that only tells us so much. So all we have is what these people remembered. And so knowing how, I don't claim to be an expert psychologist by any means, but having a basic understanding of how memory works in general, we're all people, we all work on the same operating system, comes in handy. So just knowing what sort of things affect memory, and how it affects it, I think is important. So that kind of underlies a lot of this. And then realizing that you can connect a lot of these different controversies back to what the individuals are remembering. They're connecting dots in their memories. And if you have a bias against one person or one thing, or, good or bad bias, you're going to fill in those gaps with that bias because you don't remember the gap where it's real fuzzy. And so you're going to fill that in. And I think you see a lot of that. McLaws is a prime example of it. I mean, Longstreet, obviously, Pendleton, certainly. And then some of the, I don't want to say minor players because they play a big role in the memory of it, but lesser known today, I guess, in popular, your Olmsted Longs, your Charles Marshalls,
Right.
You get into it, you know who they are, but if you're just if you watch the movie, you're not really going to see them at all.
Okay. Yeah. Right. And so you mentioned Longstreet, we really haven't talked much yet about the part that he plays in this. We've kind of worked around some of the characters on the perimeter a little bit, but how much from Longstreet's many post-war accounts, he does say in his report to the effect of engineers sent out by the commanding general led us to a route that would have been disclosed to the enemy, and things of that effect. But how much in general does Longstreet's memory, or just in general his post-war writings, contribute to what is today kind of the standard interpretation?
Sure. Surprisingly, given all the how central he is to everything, I think his actual writings really don't play a huge part because they do and they don't. To the extent they affect other people's writings, which we use on a more regular basis, McLaws being the prime example. You don't have the controversy necessarily if Longstreet doesn't do some of the things he does and say some of the things he says. But as far as the minute by minute interpretation of it, most of his account is overlooked in favor of McLaws. I mean, go to the back of your favorite history book.
Right.
You're going to see McLaws. Johnston letter, McLaws. And you're going to see one account from McLaws. McLaws wrote 4, I want to say off the top of my head, only on Gettysburg. And Johnston had 4 letters, 2 in 1878, 1 in 1892, and 2 McLaws. And then they don't actually talk to each other until 1892. And then 1 in 1895 to George Peterkin, who was one of Pendleton's aides.
Right. And so you're right. And that brings up a point too, when you talk about the reconnaissance, and as we start to move into the second piece of this, which is the actual countermarch itself, typically source material has been pretty limited, and you just hit on it. McLaws, letter from Johnston. When you get into the countermarch piece of it, Kershaw leaves some stuff, battles and leaders, and a letter or two to Batchelder and things of that nature. Did you find much deeper in terms of unpublished or previously unused sources that people are going to be surprised by?
I think a couple of them, yeah. And I'll leave I'll leave the particular sources to the surprise. But there are a couple. This is not a book where every source is going to be something new. Unfortunately, though, short of walking around every house in Virginia, I searched high and low for something new from Johnston. And unfortunately, his diary has not been found yet, or at least known publicly. So that was, but I did find a report that hasn't been published by or at least that I'm aware of, by another engineer. Unfortunately, it doesn't give a whole lot of insight into the specifics of Gettysburg, but it gives some very good insight into the specifics of the Engineer Corps, which came in handy. There's I didn't find it, but I used Fortescue. It was Fortescue's diary, which has recently been published. It's serviced with a Signal Corps, I think. Again, it's published. It's readily available to go buy. But I used that a lot. I haven't seen that used by a lot of Countermarch discussions. And I went through the Pendleton and the McLaws letters very thoroughly, and there are some things in there that at least I was unaware of. I'm sure there's somebody else out there that has looked at them and seen them, and they said, "What are you talking about?" I know that existed, but I hadn't seen them published anywhere, and one or two of them played a pretty big role in the interpretation of it. Okay. It's McLaws specifically. He's got a famous letter in 1873. He's got an exchange with Longstreet, but there's a little bit more behind the scenes there, which the letters at the University of North Carolina, McLaws papers, show that, again, I hadn't seen before. So we went into a lot of the papers. We did find some more sources. A lot of it is from available sources that aren't generally applied to the Countermarch, though, I'd say.
Okay. And then obviously I know that you did quite a bit of on-the-ground research with some friends of ours and things of that nature. Did you find when you were on the ground that the sources were in fact really playing out with some of your new geographical interpretations? I know we can't talk tonight about, well, I think they were on this hill instead of that hill. Buy the book, folks. You'll find out what hills they were on. But, just you want to walk us through a little bit how you kind of conducted the on-the-field research?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, when you're planning stuff out, I'm sure, it's a lot of maps and comparing accounts first, and then you figure out where I'm going to go. But there was a lot of, again, I don't live in Pennsylvania anymore, and I don't live in Gettysburg, so it was a lot of, I'm going to go out there and we got to hit these points. And but being on the ground has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, like we said before, with the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, there's certain things you can't see. You look at the map, well, it's obvious.
Yeah, right.
Get on the ground, well, right. You can't see. Some of the downfalls are, most of this happens on unprotected ground. So, I mean, not national park protected ground. There's some developments back to where this is taking place on some of the key ridges and hills, and dips and valleys are now part of a development. There's only, so you still have to use your imagination, elevations look different today, again, because of that. Roads don't run exactly where they were. Right. So there is some traipsing through bushes and trying to find stuff. One thing to keep in mind is most of it's private property, so you can't just get out of the car and start traipsing around. People live there, people own the land, so you have to be respectful of that. But there isn't anything like getting out and just looking at it. But they do tend to match up. You see, okay, this is fairly accurate. But again, which hill is which hill, and where were they here and where were they there? Again, just keeping in mind that when they're writing most of this stuff, these things don't have the connotations that they have today. Mm. I was on a hill. Well, it had to have been Little Round Top, or right. It had to have been this hill. Right. We've spent lifetimes of theirs that they spent on the battlefield. Let's say that Johnston says it took about 3 hours for his recon. I've spent more time than that on a Saturday afternoon, walking around in it. I know a lot more about the ground, and you know a lot more about the ground, and most people reading the book will know more about the ground and the battle than these guys could ever dream to have known, because they were only out there for a few minutes. So when they're rolling in September or 15 years later, oh, well, there was a hill on the back. Well, it had to have been this hill because this has a nice sign on it today. And that's not the only hill.
And you mentioned the preservation piece. I do a lot of tours on that part of town. I can't say that part of the battlefield because, like you said, it's mostly privately owned. And unfortunately, that part of the field, the preservation aspect, is getting worse all the time. There's developments going up literally as you and I are speaking right now. So it's going to become something that's going to become even harder to try to recreate to whatever extent we still can. So yeah, don't get me started on the development around Her Ridge sometime. That's kind of a pet peeve of mine. All these people want to move to Adams County to live in a bucolic setting, and then they start by carving up Her Ridge with their luxury homes. So, don't get me started on that.
Well, I won't get you started. I can tell you though, as you know, there was one of the first books I picked up was Ralph Siegel's because he has the guide there for the Countermarch. I picked up the book, and my wife will tell you all about what a great time it was. But we went up and down Hare's Ridge in the car, and there was a mailbox that Ralph points out as being kind of by the Adam Butt farm.
Yeah,
and
right.
That little landmark is now
gone
under development.
Yep.
So
all under development.
All those lanes that they use to get across fields are all driveways and sidewalks now.
Yeah, no, it sure is. So, okay, so maybe we'll move more into the Countermarch. Yeah. When we last left here, Johnston has kind of come back from his reconnaissance. You want to kind of pick things up in terms of what you think his role is in quote unquote leading Longstreet in a position, how that may or may not differ from traditional interpretations, and then how the heck it all goes so wrong.
Yeah. So as a disclaimer, this will be one part. This is probably the most revelatory part of the book. So I won't go too much into detail, but as far as Johnston and leading, I will flat out say I don't think he was the guide. I don't think he was intended to be. Again, I don't think anybody's lying, and I kind of go through in the book how McLaws, I think, honestly misunderstands Johnston's role, and how Johnston honestly misunderstands what McLaws is trying to say. There again, just back to assumptions and filling in gaps. And what do we think when somebody says that hill? We assume it means one thing, but they're looking at it from a very different point of view than we are.
Yeah.
I think there's terminology differences between us today and looking back what they meant. But Johnston, I don't think was ever intended to lead McLaws or Longstreet or anybody position. I think he is probably right when he says I was basically there. I forget the quote. I probably should have prepared and had a couple of quotes in front of me. But he essentially says I was there to give him the benefit of my reconnaissance, which was primarily a reconnaissance of the federal position, not a route reconnaissance.
Okay.
And so he does end up being towards the front of the column at some point. But so people perceive it in their different locations. They think, oh, well, he must be leading the column. But I don't think he actually was.
Now McLaws has that rebuttal where McLaws says to the effect, he, meaning Johnston, seems to not understand what his role should have been as a reconnoitering officer. And so from that perspective, if that's not Johnston's role, who or how, in your opinion, should Longstreet and McLaws know where to go? Are they using maps? Is somebody else directing them? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah. Well, there is a reconnaissance done by I guess scouts for Longstreet. It's not John Clark, which is a whole nother part of the conversation we may or may not even get to, which is fine. But it's not Clark. So there are route reconnaissance going on, but not necessarily while Johnston's gone, but while they're figuring this all out, while Lee is figuring this out. Longstreet is also doing things. He's not. It's not this standard interpretation where he's just sitting back waiting for something and drinking tea with Fremantle. Talking about having different dreams is from the British. But
so wait a minute, that didn't happen. Is my whole no? Forget it. We won't even go.
Not quite. Not quite the same. But Fremantle makes quite a few appearances in the book. He's he's in there quite a bit. But there is a route reconnaissance going on. Lee has people conducting route reconnaissance at the time. And Johnston may or may not know this, but he has to assume it. Again, this is not the first day in the Army for Johnston. He knows how things work. One of the quotes I revisit a few times in talking about this is Benjamin Humphreys. Or actually, no, I lied. It's not Benjamin Humphreys. It's James Goggin.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Again, not somebody you talk about a lot.
No.
James Goggin is the adjutant for McLaws' division. And he says in a letter to Longstreet, 1880 something, I want to say late 1880s, we had no guide. So whether that's memory, faulty memory, out of position, whatnot, but he says we had no guide, specific guide going into position that day. So this is something that has been told, I think, to them before. And in all honesty, look at a map, or any of the listeners look at a map. If you're at the end of Harris Ridge Road, there's not a lot of complicated directions to get to the intersection by Warfield's house.
Even less so in 1863. Yeah.
Cross the Fairfield Road and stay on that road until you see the other Confederates. So that's fairly straightforward. So I don't really think they need a guide. It's where the heck do we go from here on the way back? That's where there's a guide. And again, I won't give it away here, but there is somebody, in fact, who is told, hey, go meet McLaws' column and bring them back to this point. And so at that point, there is a guide. But that's just to answer your question about who was guiding them.
Okay, yeah. And I think, and again, having read the book, I think I know who the person is you're referring to, but we'll keep that as one of the secrets. How about, probably when I give Longstreet specific tours or Countermarch specific tours, and Countermarch particularly, the number one question I will always get asked, why didn't they follow Alexander? So for sake of the argument here and for the sake of time, they say they get to a hill from which they say the signal officers on Little Round Top flags can be seen waving. Meanwhile, Alexander had supposedly gone on ahead with the artillery. And again, everybody always says, why didn't they just follow Alexander's route? Everything I just said, kind of traditional interpretation and that common question, are all pieces in a lot of ways you dismantle during the book. So you want to just take it from there and A, answer the question if it can be answered, but B, again, kind of lead us more towards what you think actually happened and how it's different.
Yeah. So I don't think that, and again, this is one of the, I think is an important part of the book. It is toward the end, so you got to read all the way through it. But I think most of that is misremembered. I think most of that is, frankly, is wrong. Again, not intentionally, not because anybody, didn't research hard enough or anything like that. It's just the one or two accounts we have of that say things. But one of the approaches I took to the book was there can't be contradictions in fact. There can certainly be contradictions in what people remembered and said and wrote about, but something happened. Things that I tried, again, one of the I guess themes of the book is there is no contradiction in fact.
Okay.
Contradictions in accounts, absolutely. Only one thing happened on July 2nd. There weren't, McLaws said this happened, Longstreet said this happened, Lee said that happened, Pendleton. If they all said different things, obviously those four different things didn't happen at the same time. So how do we figure out which one happened? And so the approach I took was, it's almost like, I'm a dad. I know something happens when you have kids and you get middle aged, that if something happens outside the front window, you have to go look at what it is, right? You see a police lights down the street. I got to figure out what's going on. There's something happening. You go to one window and you get kind of a little bit of a look. So you go to the side window, you go to the other window. And by going to all of those different windows, you can get a pretty good idea of what's happening. And so I kind of took that approach, as taking everybody's account and seeing what could be verified by other people and seeing what was just kind of, well, this doesn't make any sense. And so putting that together, I don't think that Alexander was with McLaws. I don't think there were tracks for McLaws to follow out of the Black Horse Tavern Road. And not to be coy this time, but there's a lot of backstory to get to that point, to really fill in, I think, to explain how that all happens and why that is my interpretation. Obviously, that's why the book is there, because it fills in those gaps and it leads up to that point. But I don't think there's tracks for McLaws or Longstreet to follow when they're out on the Black Horse Tavern Road.
Okay, fair enough. And ultimately, maybe as we kind of start to wind down here, but ultimately, in your view now, how much time do you think is ultimately consumed with the so-called countermarch? And then really leading, what I always say is ultimately the bigger picture. Does it matter? What impact do you ultimately think it does or doesn't have on Longstreet's attack against, Sickles's front on the afternoon of July 2nd? So you want to tackle both of those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the amount of time, I'd say approximately 2 to 2.5 hours from the time that maybe they're supposed to get there to the time they get, maybe 3 hours, doing some quick math again in my head. Because so I think they step off in the 10:30 to 11 o'clock range.
Okay.
To get, the McLaws, by the time they get the orders and they get back to their command, and it's and they get everybody moving and standing up and in line, and they do, that doesn't happen like that. So it does take a few minutes. So let's say 10:30 to 11. And one other point just about the book in general is this is not a minute by minute. Time is so fluid, and just a very different understanding back then of time and its importance of specific minutes. And we have the atomic clock in iPhones. They had the sun and maybe a watch that was set 5 days ago by a clock that was also wrong
on somebody else's time.
Yeah. So that's why, and you'll see that when I started looking at the reports differently. Just as the aside, most of the reports will say noontime, early morning, sunrise. They might then connect that dot to a specific time, but they tend to be positions of the sun and that they're judging time by. So just as an aside, there is no minute by minute. These are very broad times we're talking about. So I think they step off 10:30 to 11. They should be there if you do the calculations. I think they stop around, 11:45, 12 o'clock. Then they got to go backwards. So you're not getting, McLaws's column's not getting there to, let's say, 12:30 or so anyways. And by all accounts, they're close to in position, or at least McLaws is, by 2:30, 3 o'clock. The artillery's up there. Everybody's filing into their position. Then you have Hood and the position of the troops in the peach orchard and everything. That extends it even farther, but that's not countermarch necessarily.
Right.
Oh, well, now we're here. And that's going to come into play either way, because one of the points that I make, and I'm not the only person to ever make this by any means, but it's not it's not the time of day that triggers what Sickles does and where he goes. It's what the Confederates are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So Confederates do this 2 hours earlier. Sickles is doing things 2 hours earlier. And so this is not just okay, let's get rid of everything and Sickles moves up at 1:30 or whatever time you want to pin down. Sickles is reacting based on what Anderson's troops are doing, based on what his Berdan's sharpshooters are telling him, based on what Birney's reporting to him. And so then he starts to move. If all of that's happening 2 hours earlier, well, he's getting the info earlier and he's doing things earlier. Does the exact same thing happen? Who knows? Great what if. But it's not, Sickles didn't say, hey, at 1:30, let's move up here. He said, this is what's going on. So that effect is not what, you can't just remove everything, one piece and say everything else stays the same, because
it's a reaction to things that are going on. Right.
Yeah. Right. And so I don't think, time wise, I do think they're there about 2 hours, 2.5 hours later than they expect to be. As far as the actual effect on the battle, again, I think it's overblown, and a lot of it's overblown because of what happens post-war with the debates of the people who were there. You're definitely going to have a different scenario on July 2nd. You might not visit the peach orchard. You might not visit the Trossel farm. Maybe the National Park Service stop in wayside markers at their Patterson farm. It's the George or John or Jacob, whatever Weichert farm. And so it certainly affects it, but I don't think it causes that. And then the last point on that, and again, there's more to it in the book, but this is
right. This is the wet your whistle kind of thing. Right.
So you have different battlefield points. I think the effect is still the same. And, unless you want to make the point that Rhodes's assault, or that doesn't happen, is stopped because of darkness, or early is, but the battle's not really stopped by Longstreet by any means, is not stopped because of a lack of daylight. He's stopped because they're stopped. Anderson, eventually you run out of daylight just in general, but by the time you get to daylight having an effect, the battle, in my opinion, is essentially over.
Okay. All right. And so if you just basically said from a battle perspective, maybe not a significant impact, then why after all these years is this still such a hot topic among Gettysburg enthusiasts? And kind of the 1-2 punch of, where did Johnston go on his reconnaissance? What did it tell Lee? And then kind of the second punch there being the countermarch and how that all happened. If it doesn't have a huge impact, why, in your opinion, are guys like us, people like us, are people like us still debating, and sometimes passionately debating, these topics? Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, I think primarily because of the memories of the soldiers who fought here. The Confederates had a lot more reason to write and justify things about the war in general, and specifically Gettysburg, than the Union soldiers did. They both suffered, immensely. Society suffered. The individual soldiers and families suffered. At the end of the day, you go through a trial like that, it's a lot easier to let it go if you win. The Confederates didn't, obviously, and right or wrong, and this is not there's no justification, villains, good guys, bad guys, or anything. It's just this is a because book, not a justification book. But the South lost, and they lost a lot of men. They lost their way of life. Maybe that's a very good thing, but they still lost it. And no matter who you are, whether you're fighting for a good cause or you're fighting for a bad cause, whether you think it's good in the end or you think it's bad or somebody else does, doesn't matter, because your society crumbles. There's going to be a reaction and an effort to salvage something for that kind of loss. And so the Confederates are much more interested in who's to blame for all of this. And obviously Jubal Early is well known for his efforts in doing that. It's I don't like to use the word lost cause, even though Jubal Early brought it up and he's the one that used it, because it does have a political connotation to it today. And I really try to stay away from that. But you can't fully get away from it. This was a political, they were political people, and so the Confederates are trying to justify and make sense of why a quarter of their white male population is destroyed, why their cities are destroyed, why their system is destroyed. They have to kind of rebuild and start over. And part of that, like any society, is going to be coming up with an origin story. And why are they in the position they're in? Well, because of Gettysburg. And why are they in Gettysburg? Well, there's actually a bunch of people at the beginning. Longstreet, as he would readily admit to you, has zero sense of political skill.
Right.
And doesn't kind of take things laying down. And so that combined with Early, who's very good at what he does, he's a lawyer. He knows how to make.
I know a few of those guys. Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's but so it becomes this battle of words, and it's much more than this. Oh, well, you lost the battle. It's because of you, we don't have our society in our country. And so that cuts deep, and Longstreet doesn't back down like many of the people do. He wasn't killed. Jackson's dead, Stewart's dead. They're in the pantheon, right. The Confederacy. If the wilderness kills him, I think he's on Stone Mountain.
Yeah, agree.
But he does survive, and he talks a lot, and he's not very good at politics. And so he's an easy target, and because Longstreet's attacked, McLaws comes in, they throw it back to Lee's guys, Johnston's on Lee's side, and then you have this mix. And so that becomes one of the Confederates' causes of the loss of Gettysburg. And so when we're studying it, we're going to take first-person accounts, and I think we rely on the absolute truth of those, even though we all know they're not. They were there. We're going to believe what they said, but they were,
like it or not, it's the best we've got in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that long story of trying to justify things that are hard to justify, and they're just caught in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm. So last question, and then I'll ask you to just tell us a little bit more about the book. One thing that surprised you the most when you were working on this? It could be something you learned or just anything. What surprised you the most?
That is a very good question, because there were a lot of things that surprised me.
Okay.
I would probably say what we just talked about, at least off the top of my head, is how much that political aspect played. We all know it plays some degree in memory, but that there was really nothing about the Countermarch specifically out there. And it really doesn't come out at all, other than, like you mentioned, Longstreet's 2 sentences in his report.
Right.
Other than that, and Kershaw mentions turning around, and his one brigade commander who writes a report, Moffett, he writes, we had a countermarch. Nobody else really writes about a countermarch until at least 10 years after the war, and it doesn't become a big issue until 15 years later. And so I think the lack of information was kind of, the silence was deafening, as they say.
Yeah. And it's kind of bringing this back full circle. It's been that lack of information that's kind of fueled a relatively consistent historical theory ever since then. And I think your book is going to kind of maybe poke some holes in what the consistent narrative has been up until now. So, okay, so the book, first of all, it's Allen Thompson. The book is In the Shadow of the Round Tops, Longstreet's Countermarch, Johnston's Reconnaissance, and the Enduring Battles for the Memory of July 2nd, 1863. Allen, when is the book going to be available?
As of now, June 27th is the release date, just in time for the anniversary.
Okay, and that's June 27th, 2023, depending on when somebody ends up watching this.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We should mention too, right? Because these days, And again, it's a little bit of a pet peeve with me, but these days, every time a good Civil War book or a Gettysburg book comes out, the first thing, for better or worse, that people always ask is, are there any maps in it? You want to talk a little bit about the maps and who did those?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing it up. Phil Lano did the maps, his great Gettysburg Atlas. So Phil was kind enough to do those. We worked on a Gettysburg magazine on the article that I did on Johnston. So he has retired from that endeavor, but was nice enough to pick the maps, the pen, if you will, back up. So I believe there were 8 altogether. Brand new maps by Phil Lano. Quite a bit of photos too. I like, the terrain is very important. So we added a lot of photos that I took while I was out there. And David Battalla was kind enough to allow the photograph of Johnston to be reprinted in the final copy as well. So there's a photograph of Johnston. You'll probably find it somewhere else too, but it'll be in this book as well. And some of the UNC was nice enough to allow me to print some of the McLaw's papers in there too. So
okay.
You can see how difficult it is to transcribe a McLaw's letter firsthand.
Yeah, I actually have done that, so yeah, I can attest to that. And with the Johnston photo, I'm still old enough to remember a time when people said there were no known Johnston photos out there. And thanks to your work, we now have a much better idea of what he looks like in terms of getting that photo publicized. So another thing to look forward to.
Yeah, I was just going to give a shout out and credit to Ron Coddington of Military Images and Dave Battalla. That's where it first came out and brought it to my attention.
Okay.
And they were nice enough to get us in touch with Dave Battalla, who allowed me to use it in the couple of things that I've done on them. So I guess I should plug my website, allenrthompson.com. It's ALLEN RTHOMPSON.com. There's a link to the book. There's when events start rolling in, there'll be some events that are up there. There's going to be an annotated or a digital rather bibliography. So we'll try and link you to some of the sources.
In the Shadow of the Round Tops. And I can guarantee this is a book that Gettysburg enthusiasts will be talking about. So the theories and going out and trying to stand on the right hill and all of that stuff and try to assess it for themselves. So once this comes out, Allen Thompson is a name and an author that if you don't know him already, you will know. So Allen, thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I appreciate it.
No, well, thank you for having me. It was great.
All right. Well, we'll connect soon. Take care.
Perfect. Thanks.